I never thought I'd change, but 10 years into my marriage, something shifted inside me. My wife, Chioma, couldn't understand why I'd become cold and distant. I'd brush her off, telling her I was fine, but I'd stopped eating her food and stopped talking to her the way I used to. As the days turned into weeks, Chioma's concern turned to frustration. She'd try to talk to me, to get me to share what was bothering me, but I'd just shut her down. I knew I was being cruel, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. I remember the day she confronted me, demanding to know what was going on. Her voice trembled with emotion, and I could see the pain in her eyes. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Instead, I lashed out, body shaming her, telling her she wasn't the same woman I married 10 years ago. Reminding her that her stomach had grown so big and stretched marks all over her body. "You're not the same woman I fell in love with," I said, my words cutting deep. "You've changed, Chioma. You've gained weight, and you're not as attractive as you used to be." Chioma was taken aback by my words. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I could see the hurt and betrayal written all over her face. "Is that what this is all about?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're tired of me because I've gained weight? You're tired of me because I'm not as attractive as I used to be?" I didn't respond. I just stood there, looking at her with a mixture of guilt and shame. Chioma took a step closer to me, her eyes blazing with anger. "You know what, Charles," she said. "I'm not the same woman I was 10 years ago. I've changed, and I've grown. Let me tell you, I've given you 4 beautiful children, sons and daughters, and you expect me to look the way I was 10 years ago." I felt a pang of guilt at her words, but I couldn't bring myself to apologize. Instead, I just stood there, looking at her with no regret. "I'm sorry, Chioma," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I never knew it had to be this way. But I have to be honest with you. I've met someone else, and I intend to marry her." Chioma's eyes widened in shock, and she took a step back as if she'd been punched in the gut. "You're going to marry someone else?" she repeated, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're going to leave me for someone else?" I nodded. I said again. "But I have to follow my heart. I have to do what makes me happy." Chioma looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I could see the hurt and betrayal written all over her face. "You're going to regret this, Charles," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to regret leaving me for someone else." I tried letting her understand that her position as a first wife still stands and she is not leaving my house. Instead, I just stood there, looking at her with no regret, and told her that I am an African man and am entitled to as many wives as I want. I also reminded her my grandfather married 4 wives and my father married 3 wives, and it won't get to my time and become an abomination. As the days turned into weeks, Chioma and I barely spoke to each other. The tension between us was palpable. But I was resolute in my decision. I was going to marry Cynthia, no matter what Chioma said. Looking back, I realize how selfish I was. I didn't care about Chioma's feelings or the impact my decision would have on our children. All I cared about was satisfying my desires. On that Saturday evening, I brought in Cynthia, my second wife, who I had told Chioma about. I met Chioma in the sitting room playing with my first daughter, Adana. I told Chioma, my wife, "I've brought in Cynthia, the lady she has to share her pot with." She disrespected me in front of my daughter and later told her to go and play with her siblings without minding Cynthia, my new wife, standing beside me. I went ahead and introduced them to each other saying, "Cynthia, meet my wife Chioma, and Chioma, this is Cynthia, the new wife I told you about." There was a moment of quietness between Cynthia and Chioma. They were just looking at each other, but the bitterness in Chioma's face was obvious. They spent a minute looking at each other. I only wished I knew what was going on in their minds. One morning, I overheard Cynthia trying to make small talk with Chioma in the kitchen. She asked Chioma about her day, but Chioma just shut her down. Cynthia looked taken aback, but she didn't push the issue. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that I was the one who had brought this tension into our home. As the day went on, things only escalated. Chioma and Cynthia got into a heated argument in the kitchen, and I had to intervene to prevent things from getting out of hand. In the chaos, Chioma accidentally cuts her hand with a knife she was dragging with Cynthia. I rushed to her side, trying to comfort her, but she just pushed me away. "You're always taking her side," she spat at me. "You're always defending her. What about me? What about my feelings?" Her voice was laced with venom, and I knew I had to tread carefully. I tried to calm her down, to reason with her, but she was beyond consolation. She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me feeling helpless and frustrated. I looked over at Cynthia, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and sadness. Later that day, I watched as Cynthia tried to make amends with Chioma. She offered to help with dinner preparations, and despite initial resistance, Chioma eventually allowed her to assist. I was surprised by the way Cynthia handled the situation calmly and patiently, trying to win Chioma over. As they worked together, I could see the tension between them start to dissipate. Cynthia even managed to get Chioma to crack a smile, and for a brief moment, things felt almost normal again. I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. But that moment was short-lived. When I walked into the kitchen and mistakenly praised Cynthia for the delicious soup, Chioma felt hurt and stormed out of the kitchen. I realized too late that my thoughtless comment had undone all the progress Cynthia had made. As I looked at Cynthia, I could see the frustration in her eyes. She had tried so hard to make things work, and yet it seemed like no matter what she did, Chioma was determined to resent her. I knew I had to do something to fix the situation, but I had no idea where to start. I tried to talk to Chioma, to reason with her, but she just wouldn't listen. She was too hurt, too angry. And I couldn't blame her. I had brought this situation on myself, and now I had to deal with the consequences. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our home only grew. Chioma and Cynthia barely spoke to each other, and I was caught in the middle. I felt like I was being torn apart, like I was losing myself in the process. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Chioma and Cynthia sat on opposite sides of the table, their eyes fixed on their plates. I tried to make small talk, but it fell flat. Suddenly, Cynthia spoke up. "Chioma, I want to talk to you about something." Her voice was calm, but I could sense a hint of determination behind it. Chioma looked up, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" she asked gruffly. Cynthia took a deep breath. "I know things have been tough between us, but I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make our family whole again." Chioma's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of hope. But then her face hardened again, and she looked away. "I appreciate your willingness to try, Cynthia," she said coolly. "But it's going to take a lot more than just words to fix things between us." And with that, the conversation was over. The tension in the room was palpable, and I knew that we still had a long way to go before we could even begin to heal. As we finished dinner and the evening drew to a close, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for our family. Would we be able to overcome our differences and find a way to live together in